Welcome to my channel, The World of Science Fiction. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. The dust on Styx was less a soil and more a finely ground accusation. It coated every surface in a uniform layer of gray, a sterile powder ground from eons of micrometeorite impacts on lifeless rock. Kalen felt it in his lungs, a permanent grit that no filtration system could ever fully scrub. He stood his watch on the outer gantry of containment block Gamma, his gaze sweeping over the pitted plains under the weak, distant light of a star named Cygnus X-1. It was a place of endings, a final repository for the Dominion's most inconvenient secrets and its most volatile prisoners. Kalen was just another piece of equipment here, a warden whose own past was as barren as the landscape he surveyed. His armor was scarred, the midnight blue plate of the Corrections Division scoured by sand and memory. Beneath it, the older, deeper marks in his flesh told a different story. One of a legionnaire who had once carried the Dominion's eagle standard into the fires of unification wars. Those fires had burned out long ago, leaving him cold and hollow. Duty was the only thing that remained, a rigid exoskeleton that held him upright when nothing else would. He checked the chronometer on his gauntlet. For more hours until rotation. For more hours of watching nothing happen, a vigil over a tomb. The comms unit in his helmet crackled with the voice of Warden Orso, a man whose tone had been sandblasted into a permanent rasp. Kalen, report to Central Processing. We have a new arrival. High priority transfer from the core worlds. Kalen's posture didn't change. Acknowledged, he turned from the railing, his mag boots releasing their grip on the metal deck with a dull thud. New arrivals were rare. High-priority ones, even rarer. Usually, they were disgraced political figures or rogue psions, their minds shattered by the Dominion's re-education protocols. They were broken things, easily managed. This felt different. A current of unease, faint but persistent, ran through the station's recycled air. Central Processing was a sterile white sphere at the heart of the facility, bathed in the merciless glare of industrial lumens. Orso stood beside a looming stasis pod, his arms crossed over his thick chest. He was a bull of a man, wide and unmoving, his face a roadmap of failed campaigns and bitter compromises. He nodded once as Kalen approached, his eyes fixed on the pod's opaque plasteel viewport. Designation, Asset 734, Orso said, his voice low. Direct orders from Prefect Valerius himself. Maximum security, zero interaction protocol. They say it wiped out the entire 3rd Legion fleet at Cyprus. Kalen felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. The 3rd Legion. He had served with them, bled with them. He looked at the pod, at the faint, shimmering field that held its occupant in temporal suspension. A monster that could annihilate a fleet was now his responsibility. He saw no triumph in it, only the grim, grinding mechanics of the system he served. What is it? Kalen asked, his voice flat. They don't say. Orso grunted. The manifest is sealed. Just xenomorphic entity, you're on primary watch. Your record makes you the most qualified to handle contingencies. Orso's gaze met his. And for a moment, Kalen saw a flicker of something beyond protocol, a shared understanding of the kind of violence the Dominion was capable of, both in its execution and its containment. Just watch it, Kalen. Don't think about it. Don't try to understand it. Just watch. The pod was moved to a specialized cell at the deepest level of the prison, a chamber ringed with redundant energy projectors and layers of ablative armor. For 3 cycles, Kalen stood his post outside the transparent wall, watching the shimmering distortion within the stasis field. There was no sound, no movement. It was like guarding a ghost. He was alone with the silence and the low hum of the containment grid, the quiet pressing in on him, stirring memories he had long sought to bury. He remembered the screams at Cyprus, relayed over the fleet comms before the channel went dead. He remembered the faces of men he knew, now reduced to a line item in a manifest. On the 4th cycle, something changed. The lights in the corridor flickered, a momentary dip in the station's power grid. An amber alert klaxon sounded, a single, mournful whoop that was silenced almost as quickly as it began. Inside the cell, the stasis field wavered, its perfect silver sheen resolving for a split second into a translucent curtain. And Kalen saw her. She was not the monstrosity he had imagined. She was humanoid, her form slender and impossibly graceful, suspended in the amber fluid of the failing field. Her skin was the color of pale moonlight, and long, silver hair floated around a face that was serene, almost beatific. But her eyes were open. They were large, dark pools of liquid night, and they were fixed on him. In them, he saw not malice, but a depth of ancient, weary pain that resonated with the hollow spaces inside his own soul. Her hands were pressed against the invisible wall of her prison, not with aggression, but with a quiet desperation, a plea. Protocol was clear. A field fluctuation was a code black event. He was to trigger the secondary lockdown, flood the chamber with neurotoxin, and await the arrival of the tactical response team. His hand went to the console, his fingers hovering over the red activation panel. But he did not press it. He saw the Third Legion's ghosts in his memory, and then he saw her eyes, and the two images refused to reconcile. He did something he could not explain, an act of quiet, irrational defiance. He keyed his personal locker code into a small dispensary unit next to the console. A nutrient paste packet, his own meager ration for the shift, slid into the receptacle. He took it, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked to the transfer port, a small airlock used for introducing sedatives or nutrients, and placed the packet inside. He cycled the lock. The packet slid down a chute and dropped into the cell, landing softly on the floor before her shimmering form. It was a meaningless gesture, an offering to a god or a demon, he did not know which. A piece of bread for a ghost. He expected nothing. But the entity, Asset 734, reacted. Her gaze shifted from his face to the small, silver packet on the floor. A tremor ran through her body. The stasis field, already unstable, flickered violently. A low hum vibrated through the deck plates, growing into a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to originate from the very atoms of the station. The lights strobed, then died, plunging the corridor into the stark, terrifying crimson of the emergency backup system. The containment field did not just fail. It shattered. It exploded outward in a wave of silent, concussive force, blowing the transparent wall into a million glittering shards. Alarms screamed to life across the entire block, a cacophony of impending doom. Kalen was thrown back against the far wall, his helmet cracking against the metal, the world dissolving into a brief, painful flash of white. When his vision cleared, the crimson emergency light painted a scene of pure chaos. The cell was open, the air thick with the scent of ozone and something else, something ancient and wild, like a forest after a lightning storm. She stood in the center of the wreckage, unbound. The silver energy of the collapsed field swirled around her like a tattered cloak. She looked at him, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of fear and dawning power. She was disoriented, a creature uncaged after an eternity, her immense strength a volatile, uncontrolled storm. Footsteps thundered down the corridor. The rapid, disciplined tread of armored boots. A tactical team. Cashin's men. Kalen knew in that instant that his life, as he knew it, was over. They would find him here, the containment field breached, the asset loose. There would be no trial, no questions. Just a summary execution for dereliction of duty on a catastrophic scale. His career, his life, his weary code of survival, all of it had been traded for a single packet of nutrient paste. He scrambled to his feet, his sides screaming in protest. He looked at her, this impossible being who had shattered his world. She was vulnerable, confused by the sudden, brutal sensory overload of freedom. The approaching soldiers would not see the being he had seen. They would see the monster from the manifest, the fleet killer, and they would open fire with everything they had. His own survival was now inexplicably tied to hers. "Come on," he grunted, the words torn from his throat. He grabbed her arm. Her skin was cool, smooth as polished stone, yet it hummed with a barely contained energy. She recoiled at his touch, but didn't pull away. Her eyes, filled with a wild intelligence, searched his. He had no time for explanations, no language to bridge the chasm between them. He just pulled, dragging her away from the cell, down a service corridor that branched off from the main artery. They ran. The station was a labyrinth of echoing alarms and strobing red lights. Kalen's mind, honed by years of Legion combat, took over. He moved with a grim purpose, choosing maintenance tunnels and ventilation shafts, pathways the tactical teams would overlook in their primary sweep. She followed, her movements unervingly silent and fluid, a silver wraith in the crimson gloom. There was a profound distrust between them, the tension of a predator and prey forced into an unnatural alliance. He was her guide in this metal world. She was his only shield against the forces he had unleashed. They emerged into a cargo bay, a vast cavern filled with stacked containers and dormant loading machinery. The distant sounds of shouting and weapons fire echoed from the direction they had come. They were being herded. Kalen scanned the bay, his tactical senses screaming. It was a kill box. The main blast doors were sealed, and the secondary exits would be covered. As if on cue, a squad of shock troopers rappelled down from the high gantries, their black armor stark against the red emergency lighting. At their lead was Centurion Cashin, his helmet off, his face a mask of cruel satisfaction. Cashin had always viewed Kalen with a mixture of contempt and jealousy. Contempt for his fall from the Legion, and jealousy for the reputation that still clung to him like a shroud. Warden Kalen. Cashin's voice boomed, amplified by the bay's acoustics. Traitor. Aiding a hostile entity is a capital offense. Surrender the asset, and the prefect may grant you a quick death. Kalen shoved the silver-haired woman behind a large durasteel container and drew his service pistol. It felt impossibly light and useless against armored soldiers. There's no talking to him, he muttered, more to himself than to her. He risked a glance at her. Her eyes were wide, taking in the soldiers, the weapons, the palpable threat. The energy around her began to coalesce, a visible shimmer in the air. It was raw, undirected power, born of fear. Light them up, Cashin ordered. Plasma bolts erupted from the troopers' rifles, searing the air with brilliant blue-white light. They slammed into the container, showering the deck with molten metal. Kalen returned fire, his shots precise, aimed at the unarmored joints of their suits. One trooper went down, clutching a shattered knee joint. But there were too many. They were advancing, using the containers as cover, tightening the net. He was pinned down, his pistol's energy cell already half depleted. Another burst of plasma fire struck closer, and he felt the searing heat wash over his face. He was out of options, a rat in a trap of his own making. He braced for the inevitable, for the bolt that would end his long, tired road. He heard a sound behind him, a soft, musical hum that cut through the cacophony of battle. He turned his head. She had stepped out from behind the container. Her hands were raised, palms outward, not in surrender, but as if to push something away. The shimmering energy around her intensified, coalescing into a sphere of pure, white light that pulsed in time with the hum. Her eyes were closed, her face a mask of intense concentration. Cashin and his men hesitated, their professional bloodlust momentarily checked by awe and uncertainty. "What is it doing?" one of them yelled. "Fire! Fire now!" They unleashed another volley. But the plasma bolts never reached her. They struck the sphere of light and simply vanished. Absorbed without a sound, without a ripple, she had not only saved herself, but she had saved him. It was the first conscious, protective act he had seen from her. Then, with a soft, indrawn breath, she opened her eyes. They were no longer dark pools of night. They blazed with an inner silver fire. She pushed her hands forward. The sphere of light did not explode. It unraveled, transforming into a wave of kinetic force that shot across the cargo bay. It was not a blast of heat or energy, but a wave of pure, physical pressure. The shock troopers were thrown from their feet like toys. They slammed into containers, into bulkheads, their armor crumpling under the invisible impact. Cashin, caught in the center of the wave, was hurled backward 20 meters, his body hitting the far blast door with a sickening crunch. The bay fell silent, the only sounds the crackle of damaged electronics and the groans of wounded men. She stood for a moment, swaying, the silver fire in her eyes fading. A line of crimson trickled from her nose. The effort had cost her. She looked at Kalen, her expression not of triumph, but of profound exhaustion and fear. He looked back, his own shock slowly receding. He had seen the power that could destroy a fleet, and it had just been used to save his life. The dynamic between them had irrevocably shifted. They were no longer just a warden and his escaped prisoner. They were survivors, bound by a shared enemy and an act of mutual protection. Kalen knew the facility's outer shell would be their only escape. He led her towards a maintenance airlock he knew of, one that vented directly onto the moon's surface. The corridors were quieter now, the main security forces likely converging on the cargo bay, drawn by the sudden silence. They moved through the guts of the station, a world of humming conduits and groaning machinery, their footsteps the only sound in the crimson twilight. The airlock cycled open with a groan of protesting metal, revealing the bleak panorama of the Stygian plains. A thin, toxic atmosphere immediately began to leach the warmth from the corridor. Kalen's armor would protect him, but she was clad only in the simple, thin shift she had worn in the stasis pod. He expected her to falter, to be ravaged by the near vacuum and the biting cold. Instead, she took a deep breath, and the shimmering aura around her intensified, forming a skin-tight, almost invisible barrier. She seemed to draw strength from the desolation, as if the emptiness of the world outside was more familiar to her than the sterile confines of the prison. She stepped out onto the gray dust, her bare feet leaving no impression. They journeyed into the wasteland. The prison facility shrank behind them, a jagged metal tooth on the horizon. Styx was a world of stark, brutal beauty. Jagged canyons carved by solar winds cut through plains of black volcanic glass that shattered underfoot. The sky was a permanent, star-dusted black, unsoftened by any atmosphere. They were hunted. Searchlights from low-flying gunships periodically swept across the plains, their beams cutting sharp, geometric patterns in the darkness. Kalen guided them, using the terrain to their advantage, sticking to the deep shadows of the canyons, moving only when the patrol patterns took the ships far overhead. For days, they traveled in silence. Their communication was a thing of gestures and shared glances. He learned to read the subtle shifts in her aura, the way it would brighten with alarm or soften when she felt safe. She, in turn, learned to trust his guidance, following his hand signals without question. During the long periods of rest, huddled in the shelter of a rock overhang, he would offer her a piece of his scavenged rations. She would accept it with a slow, graceful nod, her eyes conveying a gratitude that needed no words. He was no longer just Warden Kalen. He was just Kalen, and she was not Asset 734. He did not know her name, so in the quiet of his own mind, he began to call her Lyra, after a constellation his grandfather had once shown him on a star chart, a point of light in an overwhelming darkness. Their shared ordeal forged a strange intimacy. They were utterly alone, two disparate beings against an unforgiving universe. One night, a sudden, violent dust storm descended upon them, a roaring wall of razor-sharp particles that threatened to strip the flesh from his bones if his armor failed. He found a small cave, barely a fissure in a cliff face, and pulled her inside. They huddled together in the tight space as the storm howled outside, a primal scream of a dying world. In the darkness, lit only by the faint glow of his helmet's internal display, she reached out and gently touched the cracked faceplate. Her fingers traced the lines, then moved to the side of his helmet, where a deep gouge from an old plasma burn marred the metal. He felt a strange warmth spread from her touch, a soothing sensation that went deeper than the skin. He flinched, unaccustomed to such a gesture. She pulled her hand back, but her eyes held his. Then, slowly, she pointed to her own temple, just above her right eye. A faint, silvery scar was visible there, a delicate tracery like a frozen lightning bolt. It was a wound, he realized, not a marking. He understood. She was showing him her own damage, her own history of pain. Acting on an impulse that defied his years of emotional lockdown, he reached up and unsealed his helmet. The toxic air of Styx was thin and bit at his lungs, but he ignored it. He let the helmet drop to the cave floor. He turned his head, showing her the jagged, puckered scar that ran from his jawline into his hairline, a relic from his last battle as a legionnaire on a forgotten world called Viridia. It was a wound he had earned while following orders he knew were wrong, an external sign of the internal corrosion that had set in long ago. Viridia, he whispered, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. We were told they were insurgents. Lyra looked at the scar, and then into his eyes. She did not need to understand the word. She felt the weight behind it, the crushing guilt and regret. She reached out again, her fingers tracing the edge of his scar, not with pity, but with a profound, shared understanding. In that moment, the chasm of species and experience between them was bridged. They were both scarred survivors of the Dominion's endless, grinding wars. The storm passed, and they continued their journey. But something had changed. The silence between them was now comfortable, filled with an unspoken empathy. One evening, as they took shelter in a vast, crumbling ruin that seemed far too ancient to be of human design, she finally showed him the truth. She sat cross-legged on the floor of a great, circular chamber, the ceiling of which had collapsed, revealing the star-dusted abyss above. She beckoned him closer. As he sat before her, she placed her fingertips on his temples. He braced himself for an attack, a psychic assault, but what came was not violence. It was a flood of images, sounds, and emotions pouring directly into his consciousness. He saw a world, vibrant and green, teeming with life. He saw her people, the Ethel, moving through crystalline cities that grew from the earth like trees. They were not warriors. They were gardeners, caretakers, their lives intertwined with the planet itself, which he came to understand was a single, vast, sleeping consciousness. The Ethel were its nerve endings, its senses, its voice. Lyra was one of them. Then he saw the Dominion ships descend, fire raining from the sky. He saw Prefect Valerius, younger, his face alight with a cold, acquisitive fire, directing the invasion from the bridge of his flagship. The Dominion had not come for conquest, but for harvest. They had detected the immense planetary consciousness and sought to capture it, to weaponize it, to turn a living world into a battery for their war machine. He felt the Ethel's confusion turn to terror, then to a collective, psychic scream of agony as their world was torn apart. He watched as they were hunted, captured, dissected. He witnessed their genocide, not as a historical record, but as a visceral, personal memory. Lyra had been there. She had watched her family, her friends, her entire civilization be extinguished. She was not just a survivor. She was an ark, carrying the last spark, the final memory of her people and her world. The vision ended. Kalen stumbled back, gasping, the phantom agony of a dying world echoing in his soul. He looked at Lyra, her face wet with silent tears. The monster of Cyprus was a fiction, a lie crafted to justify her imprisonment. The Third Legion had not been destroyed by her. They had been destroyed when they tried to shatter the heart of her world, and the planet, in its death throes, had reflexively struck back. The truth settled upon him with a chilling weight. He was not protecting a monster. He was protecting a refugee, the last child of a murdered world. And the man who had ordered that murder, Prefect Valerius, was now hunting her, determined to finish what he had started. Kalen's weary, cynical detachment was burned away, replaced by a cold, hard rage. His fight for survival had just become a fight for redemption. His personal comm unit, long silent, suddenly chirped. It was a priority channel, one he hadn't used since his Legion days, a channel that bypassed local comms. The voice was crisp, synthesized, and utterly chilling. Legionnaire Kalen, this is Prefect Valerius. You have proven surprisingly resilient, and you have confirmed the asset's potential for symbiotic bonding. An impressive feat. Bring her to the coordinates I am transmitting. Your treason will be forgiven. Refuse, and this moon will be rendered down to its constituent atoms. A set of coordinates flashed on his helmet's display. Kalen looked out from the ruins. On the horizon, a new star was rising. But it was not a star. It was the fusion glow of a Dominion capital ship, descending through the vacuum. And behind it, more lights appeared. A fleet. Valerius had not sent a hunting party. He had brought his entire armada. The war had come to Styx. The scale of the Dominion's force was overwhelming. Kalen watched from the ruins as dropships descended like locusts, disgorging legions of chrome-plated soldiers and heavy assault walkers. They established a perimeter miles wide, a ring of steel and plasma closing in on their position. Valerius was not taking any chances. This was not a capture mission. It was an occupation. Cassian was at the forefront of the assault, his personal command shuttle touching down less than a kilometer from the ruins. He moved with a renewed, fanatical zeal, his hatred for Kalen now amplified by the public humiliation he had suffered in the cargo bay. His orders were likely simple: recover the asset and eliminate the traitor with extreme prejudice. We can't stay here, Kalen said, his voice grim. He checked his pistol. 4 shots left. It was a pathetic defense against an army. Lyra looked at him, her expression serene, a stark contrast to the encroaching violence. She placed a hand on his arm, her touch calming the frantic beating of his heart. She then turned and walked deeper into the ancient structure, her movements filled with a strange sense of purpose. He followed her, his instincts telling him that their only hope, however slim, lay within these forgotten walls. She led him to the central chamber where she had shown him the vision. In the center of the room was a raised dais, and upon it, a single, dormant console made of the same crystalline material as her people's cities. It was a place of power, a nexus. As she approached it, the crystal began to hum, emitting a soft, internal light. The very air in the chamber grew thick with energy. Lyra placed her hands on the console. The light intensified, and intricate patterns, like glowing nerve fibers, spread from the dais across the floor and up the walls. The entire ruin was waking up. It was not a building, it was a machine, a device. She turned to him, and this time, she did not use images. Her voice echoed directly in his mind, clear as a spoken word, a language of pure thought and feeling that transcended vocabulary. This place is a conduit, a gateway to the world soul. From here, I can try to reignite the spark. I can awaken my world. Hope, fierce and unexpected, flared in Kalen's chest. You can bring them back. Perhaps, in time, her thought voice replied, tinged with sorrow. But the process will consume me. All of my life force, the very essence of my being, will be the fuel for the rebirth. I will be scattered into the whole, my consciousness dissolved. I will be gone. Kalen stared at her, the hope dying as quickly as it had been born. She was willing to sacrifice herself to save her people. It was a choice of unimaginable bravery, but it felt like another loss, another tragedy in a war that had been full of them. There is another way, she continued, her mental voice growing faint, as if the knowledge pained her. The conduit can be regulated. A consciousness can merge with it, not as fuel, but as a governor, a warden. It can stabilize the world soul, shield it from those who would harm it, and hold it in a state of protected slumber until it is safe to reawaken. But the regulator cannot be one of us. The ethel consciousness is too resonant. It would merge and dissolve. It requires an outside mind, a human mind. The implication hung in the air between them, heavy and absolute. To become the regulator, to merge with the ancient machine, to become a living seal, a silent, eternal guardian. To lose himself, his identity, his very humanity, and become a ghost in the machine for the sake of a world he had never known. It was not a warrior's death. It was a sentence of endless, solitary vigilance. It was the ultimate prison. Explosions rocked the ruins, showering the chamber with dust and debris. Kashin's forces were beginning their bombardment. They had no time. The choice was his. Kalen looked at Lyra, at her luminous, trusting eyes. He thought of his life, a long, gray road of following orders, of fighting for a corrupt system that had discarded him the moment he was no longer useful. He thought of the ghosts he carried, the faces of the dead on Viridia, the memory of the Third Legion at Cyprus. All his life, he had been a weapon in someone else's hand. He had enforced the will of tyrants and protected the guilty. His existence was a scar, a testament to a life spent serving nothing of value. Now, he was being offered a chance for it to mean something. His end could be a beginning for an entire civilization. His sacrifice could be an act of creation, not destruction. It was an impossible choice, and yet, in the grim calculus of his soul, it was the only one that made sense. The jaded veteran, the reluctant savior. He had run from that role his entire life, and now it had found him at the end of the universe on a dead moon. He looked at the glowing console, and then back at Lyra. He did not need to speak. His decision was made, a quiet, solemn acceptance that settled over him, extinguishing the last embers of his fear. He gave her a single, slow nod. Her mental voice was a whisper of profound sorrow and infinite gratitude. Thank you, Kalen. He walked towards the dais, his movements calm and deliberate. He took off his scarred helmet and let it fall to the floor. He unstrapped the useless pistol and set it aside. He was no longer a warden, no longer a legionnaire. He was just a man, facing his final duty. He placed his hands on the crystalline console. It was warm, and it thrummed with a life that resonated deep in his bones. He took a deep breath, the dust-filled air of the chamber feeling strangely clean, and closed his eyes. He was ready. The main entrance to the chamber imploded, blasted inward by a shaped charge. Through the smoke and dust strode Centurion Cashin, his plasma rifle leveled, his face a snarl of triumphant hatred. Behind him, a squad of elite shock troopers fanned out, their weapons trained on Kalen and Lyra. "It's over, traitor," Cashin spat, his voice dripping with venom. "The prefect wants the creature alive. You, however, have earned a very slow, very public death." Kalen didn't turn. He kept his hands on the console, his back to his old life, to the violence and hatred that Cashin embodied. "You're too late," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Kill him," Cashin screamed, his composure finally breaking. A storm of plasma bolts converged on Kalen's position. But before they could reach him, Lyra moved. She stepped in front of him, a living shield, her arms spread wide. The shimmering aura around her flared into a blinding nimbus of silver light, absorbing the full onslaught. The energy washed over her, and she cried out, a sound of pure agony that was both physical and psychic. The shield held, but the effort was immense, causing the very stones around her to crack. From the back of the chamber, another figure emerged from the dust. Prefect Valerius. He was clad in ornate, ceremonial armor, but he carried no weapon. He simply observed the scene with the cool, detached curiosity of a scientist watching a particularly interesting chemical reaction. "Magnificent," Valerius murmured, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Such power, such potential. Centurion, stand down. Do not damage the asset." Cashin, blinded by his rage, ignored the order. "She is shielding the traitor. I will have his head." He raised his own rifle, taking careful aim. Kalen knew Lyra could not maintain the shield forever. He had to act. He had to complete the circuit. He pushed his own will, his own consciousness, into the console, trying to connect with the immense machine beneath him. But it resisted him. It was an alien system, its pathways and logic beyond his comprehension. He was an impurity it could not accept. "It needs a key," Lyra's voice strained in his mind. "A command protocol. The builders, they shared a common ancestral tongue with your own distant past. A root language of command." Kalen's mind raced. An old language? A command protocol? His Legion training kicked in, dredging up esoteric lessons on military history, on the Dominion's affectation for the classical traditions of old Earth. There were command phrases, activation codes, buried deep in his memory, words he had never understood the origin of. Just then, Cashin, defying his prefect, fired. The plasma bolt was perfectly aimed. It bypassed Lyra's shield, striking Kalen in the shoulder. The impact was titanic. He was thrown sideways, his body erupting in agony, his armor melting, his flesh vaporizing. He cried out, stumbling, his hands slipping from the console. He was dying. He could feel his life bleeding out onto the dusty floor. He looked at Lyra, who was now faltering, her shield flickering as her concentration was broken by his pain. He saw Valerius starting to move forward, a look of ultimate victory on his face. In the ruins, nestled in a shadowed alcove, a piece of forgotten technology stirred. It was an ancient automated sentry, a relic from some long-dead war, its power source barely a trickle. It registered the chamber's energy surge, its optical sensors flickering to life. It could not discern friend from foe. It awaited a command. Lyra saw Kalen fall. She saw the sentry flicker to life. She understood. All the pieces were there. With the last of her strength, she focused her mind, not on defense, but on one single, desperate broadcast. She spoke, not with her mind, but with her voice, a clear, bell-like tone that filled the chamber. The words were alien to this time and place, yet they resonated with an ancient authority. She answered in Old Earth Latin. Presidium activare. Hostilere. Decretum est. The War Relic locked on her voice. A synthesized, emotionless tone echoed from the alcove, a voice unheard for 1,000 years. Orders received, General. A beam of incandescent energy, far more powerful than any plasma rifle, shot from the alcove. It did not target Lyra or Kalen. It lanced across the room and struck Cashin squarely in the chest. He vanished in a flash of white-hot light, his scream cut short. The The shocked troopers, stunned, turned their weapons towards the new threat, only to be cut down one by the relentless, precise fire of the ancient sentry. The momentary reprieve was all Kalen needed. He ignored the searing agony in his shoulder, the graying of his vision. He pushed himself back to the dais, hauling his ruined body forward with his one good arm. He pressed his bloody hand back onto the console. This was his last chance. Lyra rushed to his side, her shield gone, her own energy nearly spent. She saw that he could not connect. She saw Valerius, who had survived the sentry's initial volley by diving behind the rubble, now rising, a look of pure fury on his face. She made a choice. She placed her hands not on the console, but on Kalen. She poured what was left of her life force, the sum total of her Ethel heritage, the last spark of her world, directly into him. She would not be the fuel for the world soul. He would. But she would be the catalyst that allowed the connection. The energy surged through him, a torrent of silver fire. It was not a gentle merging. It was an agonizing apotheosis. His human consciousness, his memories, his pain, his guilt, all of it was scoured, burned away, and reformed by the sheer force of her being. The console accepted him. The conduit opened. Light erupted from the dais, a column of pure, white energy that shot upward, through the broken ceiling, and into the black sky of Styx. Kalen's body dissolved, breaking down into its constituent particles of light and energy. He felt no pain. He felt everything. He was the ruin, the moon, the dust. He felt the sleeping world soul stir in its ageless slumber, and he wrapped his newfound consciousness around it, a shield, a blanket, a promise. He was Kalen, and yet he was something more. He was the Warden. The wave of energy that expanded from the conduit was not destructive. It was a wave of pure empathy. It washed over the battlefield, over the legions of Dominion soldiers. It carried with it the truth of the Ethel's genocide, the weight of Lyra's sorrow, the depth of Kalen's sacrifice. It was a psychic broadcast of understanding. Across the plains of Styx, soldiers stopped firing. They lowered their weapons, confusion and a dawning horror on their faces. They looked at their hands, at the instruments of death they carried, as if seeing them for the first time. The will to fight, the hatred, the blind obedience, it all evaporated, replaced by a profound, soul-shaking clarity. In orbit, the crews of the Dominion fleet felt the wave. Captains turned away from their fire control consoles. Officers looked at each other, the orders from the prefect suddenly feeling like the ravings of a madman. The war, for them, was over. Only Valerius remained untouched. His mind, so devoid of empathy, so insulated by its own narcissism, could not be penetrated by the wave. He stood alone in the chamber, his army inert, his prize transformed into an untouchable monument of light. He screamed in rage and frustration, a small, pathetic man shaking his fist at a star, his power utterly and completely broken. The ancient sentry, its duty done, swiveled its optical lens and vaporized him where he stood. 10 years passed. The Dominion, its military cohesion shattered by the event that came to be known as the Styx Revelation, had collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. A new galactic coalition had risen from the ashes, founded on principles of cooperation and remembrance. The truth of the Ethel was now known, a source of collective shame and a promise to do better. Styx was no longer a prison moon. It was a protected world, a memorial, and it was no longer barren. From the epicenter of the ruins, a faint, greenish luminescence had begun to spread across the gray dust. A creeping, impossible vegetation was taking root, nurtured by the steady, peaceful energy that pulsed from the conduit. The world soul was healing, slowly, patiently, under the silent watch of its new guardian. Lyra stood in the central chamber. She was no longer the last of her kind. The awakening, though gentle, had been enough. Small enclaves of Ethel had begun to re-emerge from the deep planetary consciousness, reborn into the quiet world. She was their ambassador, their guide in this new, changed galaxy. She approached the dais. The crystalline console was gone, replaced by a softly glowing pillar of light that reached to the ceiling. It pulsed with a calm, steady rhythm, like a sleeping heart. It was known as the Warden's heart. She placed her hand on its warm, luminous surface. She could feel him there. Not the man he was, not Kalen with his scars and his sorrows, but the vast, peaceful consciousness he had become. His identity was gone, subsumed into his purpose, but the core of his sacrifice remained, a silent, vigilant presence that held the system in a state of perpetual grace. He was the peace that he had fought so long to find. She felt no sadness, only a profound and somber gratitude. His was not a story of victory, but of transcendence. He had not won a war, but had instead become the reason it could never be fought again. His legacy was not written in history books or carved into statues. It was written in the greening of a dead world, and in the quiet of a galaxy that was finally, after so long, learning to be at peace. The jaded soldier had become the eternal warden, his watch finally, truly, over.